Alright, so this is going to be the lecture specifically on the anatomy of the skull. In your manual, lab manual, we're looking at pages 78 through 82. The structures and features that you are liable for are specifically listed on page 78. I'm going to run all through them with you. A couple of them really you don't have to worry about, like where it has the supraorbital margin. That's just where your eyebrow is. Don't really care about that. The other one is the hypoglossal canal, which I would have to split the skull in half for you to look at. Don't worry about that one really. And I think that's it. Alright, so let's run you through. Alright, so when you look at the skull, you have to worry about three different viewpoints of it. One is going to be face on, one is going to be from the side, one is going to be from the bottom, and the last one is going to be with the skull cap taken off. So let's start off with the front. Now again, when you get these questions, when you go to identify the parts, be very careful what you're asked for. If you're asked for a bone, you name the bone. If you're actually named for a feature, it's a feature of the bone. So just be careful if it's a bone or the feature of said bone. Alright, so if you look face on, different bones you're going to see. First off is your frontal bone. Frontal bone is going to be where your forehead is, this large area here. Next, coming on down, we have your zygomatic bones. Next, below that, then, we are going to have then your nasal bone. And then we're going to have your maxilla, which is your upper jaw, and then your mandible, your lower jaw. Other bones we have to worry about. Sticking down in the middle, if you come closer, sticking down in the middle of the nose, what you'll see is kind of like a little bony plate sticking down in the middle with two little bumps on either side. Those are all features of the ethmoid bone. However, this small one here at the bottom of the nose, this little one right here where my finger is, it's actually small in the front and it gets bigger as it goes back. That's a different bone. That is called the vomer. Below, on either side of that though, you see these little ridges right here where my fingers are. Those are called the inferior nasal concha. So inferior lower nasal concha, meaning like a shell, like a conch. Okay, you can back up again. Alright, so the bones you look at when you look at head on. We got frontal, you got zygomatics, you got nasal, you got vomer, you got the ethmoid bone, which is those features I showed you earlier. We got the maxilla, we got the mandible. Another one you can also see too, if we go to the inside of the eye socket right there, that would be ethmoid as well too. Remember ethmoid from what I said in the lecture, just think sense of smell, it's where it passes through, that's that. If we go toward the lateral side, all the way out here, that would be the sphenoid bone. Sphenoid bone, if you remember, I said goes from temple to temple. It's one of the irregular bones. Now, for features. Again, this was the supraorbital margin. It's essentially where your eyebrows are. I'm not really worried about that. However, if you look, there's a little hole above the eye. There's a little hole below the eye. So you have the supraorbital foramen. You have the infraorbital foramen. If we go into the back of the eye, come closer again. If we go into the back of the eye, like I said, there's a slit that goes up and back and a slit that goes down and forward. The one that goes up and back is called the superior orbital fissure. The one that goes down and forward is the inferior orbital fissure. All right. Also back in the nose, if you remember, there was that plate that comes down from the ethmoid bone. That is called the perpendicular plate. The perpendicular plate of the ethmoid. On either side of it, though, you see those little bumps. Those are the middle nasal concha. The middle nasal concha and the perpendicular plate are features of the ethmoid bone. And again, the lower part is the vomer again. Also down here, you see a hole right there. That is called the mental foramen. So therefore, it's the holes on your chin. All right. Trying to think if there's anything else on the front. No. All right. Now, what I'm going to do is take I'll do it from the side. So from the face side, that's pretty much what you can gather. Again, know the features from the bones. I'm now taking the head, tilting it to the side. When we do it from the side now, we can see all the major skull bones and also some of the ones you saw in the front. However, what we will be able to see are the suture marks, which are the immovable joints that are holding the skull together. Whenever you're born, they're not fused all together because the head has to form at a much more rapid rate than the rest of your body. So therefore, the brain's going to expand at a much faster pace and can't be fused all the way. Plus, to facilitate a vaginal childbirth, you can't have the skull bones fused together because then there's no way the skull is coming out of the vaginal orifice. All right, so from the side, you have the frontal bone, things we just identified. You have the zygomatic bone. You got the nasal bone. You got the maxilla. You got the mandible. Now, another bone you can see when you go to the side is right where your tear duct would be. So just think where your tear duct would be, and that is called the lacrimal bone. Lacrimal means tear-like. All right, so that's right by where your tear duct is. Now, coming on back, we have frontal. These two right here, if I take this, those two right there, those are called the parietal. So you have one on the left, one on the right. Then we have the one on the back, that's the occipital. Then you have this one here that basically would go around your ear, come down like a chin strap, go on the other side. That is called the temporal bone. And where your temple is, right there, where that screw is, that's the sphenoid. Okay, so going around, frontal, parietal, occipital, temporal, goes all the way underneath, and then sphenoid spans from one side to the other side, like I mentioned, kind of like a butterfly look if you would crack the skull all the way open in the front. All right, now, those are all the major bones. Now let's go over features. Let's go over the cracks first, the sutures. So, this one right here, it's going to separate the frontal bone from the two parietal bones. This is called the coronal suture. Then I have one, well, we all have one, that runs right down the middle. That is called the sagittal suture. Then you have the one that separates the occipital bone from the two parietal bones. That is called lambdoidal suture. Then you're going to have this crack right here that separates the temporal from the parietals. That crack right there is called squamosal suture. So again, you have the coronal suture, sagittal suture, lambdoidal suture, squamosal suture. Okay? Now, other features. Coming off the temporal bone. Okay? I'm going to take the jaw out for right now. Alright, so coming off the temporal bone. This is a process right there behind your ear. That's called the mastoid process. This little tiny pin-like thing that sticks out is called the styloid process. This process that comes off the temporal bone that reaches forward to the zygomatic bone. So if it reaches forward to grab it, that is called the zygomatic process. Now follow, the zygomatic bone has this little process that reaches back to grab the temporal bone. So that is called the temporal process. The name of the process is named for what it's reaching out toward. Okay, so this is the temporal process of the zygomatic bone. This is the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. How do you know where one begins, one ends? You follow the little cracks. The cracks are your boundary lines. Okay, let's see, what else? So we talked about this one already. That little hole right there is your ear hole. That is your external acoustic meatus. And I think that's it from where we can go from there. Now we go to your mandible. On your mandible, we have the mandibular condyle. We have this little ditch right here. That is called the mandibular notch, but also that's in your manual, but it's also called the mandibular sulcus. Remember, the sulcus is a low point between two high points. This little pointy process is called the coronoid process of the mandible. This flat part of the mandible is called the mandibular ramus. And where you make this angle to go up, that little point right there, is called the mandibular angle. So the whole thing is called the mandible. We have the mandibular angle, mandibular ramus, coronoid process, mandibular sulcus or groove or notch or whatever you want to call it, and the mandibular condyle. Okay? Don't forget any of the mental foramen also on that as well too. Now, that is looking at the skull from face on and to the side. Let's now take the skull and look at it from underneath. This is going to be difficult because I have to see what I'm looking at. All right, so ones that we have to look at. So bones we already know. Occipital bone, temporal bone. Okay. Now this up here is the upper jaw. That's the maxilla. You already know the zygomatic bones are here. So we already have a good idea where the bones are. The only new bone, though, is this bone right here. Here. you'll look right there. There's a crack right there, and there's a bone. There's a bone here, and then there's a bone here. The bone up here is the maxilla, your jaw, your upper jaw. The bone back here is called the palatine bone. Real simple. Take your tongue, put it behind your teeth, and start rolling it back. When you roll it back, it goes hard, 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 then it goes soft. Right at that juncture where it goes hard, soft, that is the palatine bone. Anything in front of that is the maxilla, which is your upper jaw. Okay? And again, how can you tell? If you look close, there's that little perpendicular crack right there. That crack, anything behind that is going to be the palatine bone. Anything in front of it would be the maxilla. Okay? Now, other bone we can see. If you remember, the vomer I said is in your nose. It's real small in front, gets bigger as it goes back. That right there is the vomer in the back. Okay? Where my finger is. Here, make it easier. That right there is the vomer. Okay? Hopefully that shows up. Now, with this then, we go over features. Again, features we already talked about. Mastoid process, styloid process. One that I didn't mention on the side that I can mention now, where the mandibular condyle fits in the temporal bone for your jaw, that's called the mandibular fossa. It's plastic on the model, but that's, again, would be cartilage so that you can, move your jaw around. Okay, and then we have the zygomatic process as well, too, as well as the temporal process. Let's see, what else? So, other feature. This is the maxilla. However, the actual name of it, the feature of it, this is called the palatine process. It says the palatine process of the maxilla. That would be what you essentially would call your hard palate. But remember, where you drop off from hard to soft, that's the palatine bone. It's not a feature. All right, let's see. Anything else before I go over the holes? These two little bumps right here, these are called the occipital condyles. The occipital condyles are what your first vertebrae sits on. That's so you can rock your head back and forth to say yes. So you use those to rock your head, occipital condyles. All right, now this is where, if you're going to miss something, this is where people miss stuff. So we're going to have to focus down here. All right, so first off, whenever we do any of this, we're going to need a landmark. The landmark we're going to look for when we do this is going to be a hole, a foramen that's oval. That's that one right there. Okay? So, that one right there is called the foramen ovale. Directly behind that is a small little hole called the foramen spinosum. Coming on back then, what we have here, this would then be right there, that little hole right there. That would be the carotid canal, and all the way back would be the jugular. So, follow the pattern. It runs parallel on both sides. It goes foramen ovale, spinosum, carotid, and then jugular. Straight back. Now, coming up the middle, you have the foramen magnum, and then you have these two little cracks, one on this side, one on that side. Those two. That's called the foramen lacerum. All right, so again, we have ovale, spinosum, carotid, and then jugular back here. Magnum, and then lacerum on both sides. Okay, one other hole all the way up here behind the incisors. That's called the incisive foramen. All right, anything else before I leave the underside? No. All right, so last but not least, we now have to take the skull cap off. So notice what I'm taking off. I'm taking off the two parietal bones. So that's the inside. So understand that means up here, this is all frontal. Back here, this is all occipital. Underneath here, that's temporal. Now the sphenoid goes from this side all the way over to this side. Okay? So if you imagine where my little pointer was, you make a straight line. Kind of looks like a weird bat body with two bat wings coming out at you. That's all sphenoid. So all this right here that I'm pointing at, including that, that's all sphenoid. All this up here is frontal. Well, what's this little thing up here in the middle? That's the ethmoid bone. If you remember from a previous lecture, I said if you watch or heard about Kung Fu, somebody punches you in the nose, you can kill them. That's what gets driven in their brain. That's what kills them. Okay? So we have frontal up here. You have then sphenoid here.
ethmoid here, occipital back here, temporal here. And then what was removed was the parietal. Okay? Now, 4 features. First off, if you look here, there's this little tiny thing that sticks up in the middle of the ethmoid bone right there. This little guy right here. It's like a little ridge. That is called the crista galli. On either side of the crista galli, on this side and on this side, is 2 little flattened areas that have little holes in them. The 2 flattened areas on either side are called the cribriform plate. The small little holes are called the olfactory foramina, the small holes for your nerves to go from the olfactory mucosal into your brain. Your olfactory bulb, where you sense smell, is sitting right here. So that's how you sense smell. All right, so again, breakdown. The whole thing is the ethmoid bone. The little ridge in the middle sticking up is the crista galli. On both sides, the 2 little depressions that have holes in them is the cribriform plate. The little holes are the olfactory foramina. Now, down here to the sphenoid bone. Okay? Sphenoid bone, if you notice, has this little U-shape area right there. That little U-shape. That little U-shape, excuse me, is brain fart. Sorry, the sella turcica. Not called brain fart, it's called sella turcica. What happens is your pituitary gland would be sitting right there. But if you notice, then there's a hole here and a hole here. So there's 2 little holes right there. Those are the optic foramen for the optic canals. So that's where your optic nerve would pass. So your 2 optic nerves would come back and crisscross right there to be contralateral and ipsilateral for your body. All right, coming on back. On the outside, we have the external acoustic meatus. On the inside, right there, that is the internal acoustic meatus, the inside ear hole. Okay? Now, again, same holes, but from the other side. You got to find your landmark. If you look, that right there is the foramen ovale. So we go ovale, spinosum. Now, carotid is tough to find because it's underneath this ridge right here. So if you come underneath the ridge, if you tilt the camera, there's a hole underneath the ridge right there. That's the carotid. Okay? And then on the other side, there's this huge crack in the back, and that's the jugular. Okay? So again, we have ovale, so ovale, spinosum. Underneath this is the carotid. In the back is the jugular. The magnum is right there. Coming up to the front, you have the 2 cracks before, right there and right there. That's the foramen lacerum. The only new one is all the way up here, right there, and right there. That is the foramen rotundum. Okay, that's the only way you can see the rotundum is if you have the skull cap off, and that's that one right there. And I think we covered everything. Let me look at the list real quick. Only thing I didn't mention was the external occipital protuberance. Unimportant, really. It's this bumpy area on the back of the skull right here. It's only found on a male skull, not a female skull. There's different ways to tell male from female. External occipital protuberance is a big bulky area for muscle attachment on a male skull. Additionally, on a male skull, the jaw angle is 90 degrees almost, whereas in a female jaw, it's more obtuse. It's laid back a little further, so it gives it a softer jawline. That's one way to tell. Also, brain pan size is another way to tell. And I think that's everything. All right, so again, can't stress this enough. You gotta study the skull. You gotta study the pictures. Study the stuff online. What I just went through is what you're liable for. Don't study more than what you're liable for. You got enough to worry about, okay? So everything that's on page 78, you got to know. You got to know where it is and what it's called, okay? Next time I see you for lab, I'll be doing the rest of the bones outside of the skull, meaning all the vertebrae, going into the ribs, sternum, the thoracic cage, also the pelvic girdle, all the way down to the toes. All right, so I'll see you then.